It's my privilege as chair to introduce this afternoon's speaker. Diana Schaub is professor of political science at Loyola University in Maryland. She received both her BA, her MA, and PhD from the University of Chicago. From 1994 to 1995, Professor Schaub was a postdoctoral fellow of the program on constitutional government at Harvard University. From 2004 to 2009, she was a member of the President's Council on Bioethics. She's taught at the University of Michigan at Dearborn and served as an assistant editor of the National Interest. She earned an AB from Kenyon College, where she was elected to Phi Beta Kappa, and as I said, her MA and PhD from the University of Chicago. So we just have one speaker. Professor Schaub will offer her remarks. We'll have plenty of time for Q&A. I was just asked, because the session is being recorded, when you do ask questions, if you can amplify your voice so that we can hear you and the mic can pick it up, that's fine. Otherwise, we'll ask that you just offer your questions into the microphone. Right? Without further ado, we'll go ahead and hear from Professor Schaub.
Well, I am very happy to be here, although I'm sorry that Michael Zuckert is not on the panel with me as originally scheduled. Even so, I feel no compunction about taking the time that would have been allotted to his remarks so that I can say a little bit more about my topic. And my topic is the unjustly overlooked American statesman Booker T. Washington and his thoughts on friendship between the races. Powered by the conviction that racial reconciliation was a necessary foundation for constitutional liberty, Washington worked diligently and deftly to reshape the American character in a way that would foster civic friendship. Maybe I just want to say a quick word about his life before we begin in earnest. He was born into slavery, freed as a youngster by the Emancipation Proclamation. By dint of extraordinary effort, he managed to acquire an education and then devoted himself to the educational and economic uplift of his people. While only in his 20s, he founded Tuskegee Institute, which he built into the showplace of black higher education. In 1895, he was invited to give an address at the Atlanta Exposition, becoming the first African American to appear on the same platform with Southern whites. Washington's speech just catapulted him to national fame. Frederick Douglass had died that same year, and Washington succeeded Douglass as the nation's best known and most highly regarded black figure, a position that he then held for the next 20 years until his death in 1915. His remarkable life story is told in his autobiography, Up from Slavery, a work that I think should be on the required reading list of all Americans. Now, the part of Washington's project that I intend to focus on is how he deployed the memory of Abraham Lincoln to address the terrible racial troubles of his time. Remember, this is the era during which segregation was becoming harsher, increasingly codified in the law. Despite the 15th Amendment, the black population had been almost completely disfranchised. The Democratic Party, not much changed from its slavocratic past, had monopoly control over the entire South, with white politicians striving to outdo one another in demagogic appeals to racial hostility. Finally, lynchings and other terroristic practices to maintain white supremacy were at their peak. Booker T. Washington, working from within the Deep South itself, Tuskegee, Alabama, he's within the belly of the beast, so to speak, had to devise a strategy and a way of speaking that would reach and transform these separate and antagonistic audiences. The invocation of Lincoln was an essential part of Washington's bridge-building rhetoric. Washington's treatments of Lincoln are of two main sorts. First, there are brief references to Lincoln in pedagogical and hortatory speeches delivered to black audiences. And then second, there are a few speeches devoted explicitly and extensively to Lincoln, presented on ceremonial occasions, mostly to white audiences. Most typical of the first, addressing black audiences, are his Sunday evening talks. This was a regular forum that Washington held for students at Tuskegee. These were sort of homilies on character formation. He often cited Lincoln, counseling emulation of his virtues, especially honesty and simplicity. So, for instance, in a talk entitled Strength in Simplicity, Washington explores various ways in which the self is projected into the world. We utter or outer ourselves, whether through words or more superficial expressions like modes of address and dress. Washington urges simplicity in all things. One's dress should be neat and modest rather than attention-grabbing. One should claim no self-aggrandizing titles, and one should use plain speech. Lincoln is offered as the model of humble self-presentation. Nobody would ever speak of Abraham Lincoln as LLD or anything of that kind. You could not add a single element of strength to his name by giving him all the titles you could conjure. More significantly, Lincoln's Gettysburg Address is invoked to demonstrate the great power of the simplest words. As a young man while at Hampton Institute, Booker had studied the speeches of Lincoln. In turn, he recommended such study to the students at Tuskegee. One lesson he derived from his study is that simple prose is not incompatible with subtle statesmanship. Within a month of this Sunday evening talk, Washington delivered his most important speech about Lincoln. On February 12, 1909, it was the centennial of Lincoln's birth. The speech was delivered before the Republican Club of New York City. Because of this longstanding commitment to deliver the New York address, Washington had to decline a late-arriving invitation to speak in Springfield, Illinois, on Lincoln's birthday. In a letter to the organizer of that event, Washington stated, "There is no spot in America where it would have given me greater satisfaction to have spoken my word, and not just because it was the city that he loved and the city where his body rests, but because of recent occurrences in this city." What Washington had in mind were the Springfield race riots of the previous summer. Those events, 2 days of intense rioting by white mobs, followed by weeks of sporadic attacks, were far from the first instance of anti-black mob action in a northern city. But they did capture the attention of the nation, both because of the location and the toll of the violence. 2 black businessmen were lynched, 4 whites dead, more than 40 black homes burned, extensive property damage to black businesses, threats against white establishments that employed or served blacks, and many injured residents. In this letter, Washington suggests that the context for these recent provocations is an increase in racial interaction. Population shifts meant that many white people in the North who are now honoring the memory of Lincoln are coming into contact for the first time with the race that Lincoln freed and behaving in very un-Lincolnian ways. Legend has it that the first person to settle in Springfield was a Haitian named William Florville, who set up a barbershop in 1831 with the advice and assistance of the young Abraham Lincoln. By 1908, the black population had increased to about 5% of the city's 50,000 residents. In the rioting, the first person lynched was a black barber. While the irony of that malicious act was doubtless not premeditated, the rioters were aware of the larger symbolic significance of their action. Some of them were heard to shout, "Lincoln freed you? Now we'll show you where you belong." In the wake of the attacks, Washington advised both groups on how they ought to handle themselves. His message stressed the need for law-abidingness on all sides. Blacks, he said, must remain patient, law-abiding, and self-controlled, as Lincoln was. Whites, meanwhile, must cease to inflict injustice upon the Negro because he is a Negro or because he is weak. Every act of injustice seeks to pull down the great temple of justice and law and order which Lincoln gave his life to make secure. The letter, which was obviously intended for publication, was printed in the Springfield News the day after the Lincoln centenary. I think it can be read as a reworking of the theme of Lincoln's Lyceum address, delivered in Springfield 75 years earlier. The Lyceum address of 1838 was Lincoln's first great speech. It, too, was composed in response to the threat of mob rule. The rash of vigilante actions at that time included the lynching or murder of gamblers, blacks, and abolitionists. To counter the danger, Lincoln recommended a political religion of obedience to and reverence for the law. The solution may be a simple one, but it was no easier to effect in Washington's day than it was in Lincoln's or than it is in our own. Interestingly, both statesmen summoned the sentiment of gratitude to assist them. Lincoln called for a national oath, sworn upon the blood of the Revolution, to support the Constitution and laws. He closed the Lyceum address by reminding his listeners of their debt to our Washington, meaning, of course, George Washington. Booker T. Washington, who had taken that illustrious surname for himself when he first attended school, lacking any knowledge that he had a last name, presented his call for law-abidingness as fidelity to the memory of the sainted Lincoln. These are names to conjure with. Lincoln invokes the name of Washington, and the second Washington invokes the name of Lincoln. Their message of moderation, because both of them are counseling moderation, moderation is always at risk of seeming tepid or mediocre. But the message of moderation is ennobled by these great examples and at the same time given firm roots in the soil of civic piety. For a fuller account of what Washington means by and expects from the invocation and imitation of Lincoln, I'd like to turn now to this New York speech. I'm sort of assuming that none of you are familiar with this speech, and so I've given you an outline of it. And maybe the first thing that you can see is its very careful construction. It has 27 paragraphs divided into 4 parts. In between the opening and the concluding parts, each of which is just 2 paragraphs in length, you get 2 substantial parts of roughly equal length, one devoted to Lincoln's legacy as chief executive, which for Booker T. Washington means the Emancipation Proclamation, and the other half to Lincoln's virtues as an individual, as a man. Each of these longer parts is in turn divided into 4 sections, and the pattern of the 2 main parts is identical. You get an introductory paragraph followed by sections addressing first blacks, then whites, and finally expanding the message to the world at large. Remember, it's not such an easy thing for a black man at this time to figure out a way to address whites. Okay, so that's a large part of what he's doing here. His opening is humble. He stresses his slave origins, telling the story of how he first learned of Lincoln through his mother's fervent prayers that Lincoln and his armies might be successful, while he credits Lincoln with turning a piece of property into a free American citizen. In a curious way, Lincoln, too, is humbled, for he is presented as an instrument used by Providence. To the extent that appeals to heaven are efficacious, slaves are not simply passive, nor were they without knowledge. In Up From Slavery, Washington stresses that slaves, although illiterate, were accurately and completely informed about the great national questions that were agitating the country. Thus, Washington's celebration of Lincoln is situated within the context of a dialogue initiated by freedom-seeking slaves with God. Despite Washington's initial demurral that he is not fitted by ancestry or training to be your teacher tonight, by the end of the introduction, he has subtly insinuated a claim to speak based on knowledge of Abraham Lincoln. The long second part of the address is an explication of a Bible verse as applied to our martyred president. The verse, which is Washington's paraphrase of John 11:25, reads, "Though a man die, yet shall he live." Washington finds that Lincoln still lives through his influence on our complex American civilization, which he describes as the moving story of men and women of nearly every race and color in their progress from slavery to freedom. In other words, blacks aren't the only ones to make this transition from slavery to freedom. Having begun with a national rather than a narrowly racial focus, Washington is explicit about his intention to confound expectations. He says, "Perhaps you expect me to confine my words of appreciation to the great boon which through him was conferred upon my race." While undying gratitude is owed to Lincoln for freeing the slaves, Washington insists that this is not the only claim that Lincoln has upon our sense of gratitude. So Washington aims to enlarge, or perhaps to deepen, the ground for both black gratitude and the nation's gratitude. After that introduction, Washington begins with his own race, asserting that Lincoln lives today in the visible educational and economic advancement of blacks. What he highlights is not the mere fact of freedom, but the successful employment of freedom. Gives a very quick survey of the records so far, cites data on things like black property holdings, black schools staffed by black teachers. 5 years earlier, again on Lincoln's birthday, Washington had delivered a speech in Madison Square Garden entirely devoted to setting forth this evidence, statistical evidence of an improving black condition. It's filled with statistics. That speech, the one 5 years earlier, mentioned Lincoln only once in the opening sentence. But now, however, Lincoln is in every paragraph, in some paragraphs every sentence. The name Lincoln appears 33 times, the pronoun he 25 times, along with other references to our martyred president, our emancipator, the great emancipator. What Washington is intent on tracking in this present speech is not what is seen, but what is unseen. Thus, after only a paragraph on the tangible evidence of Black accomplishment, Washington moves to the inward cause of that advancement, namely the steady and unalterable determination of 10 millions of Black citizens. It is through this moral aspiration towards self-betterment that Lincoln lives. Washington's analysis hinges upon the distinction between inner and outer freedom. We learn, moreover, that this distinction applies in every corner of the Republic. With this phrase, every corner of the Republic, Washington delicately begins to bring his message to bear on whites as well as Blacks. And here he must tread carefully. This is a time when Blacks who are perceived as uppity were risking their very lives. He speaks in the first person again, expressing gratitude to Lincoln for freedom of soul. The man whose soul is free is defined as someone who, quote, refuses to permit sectional or race hatred to drag down, to warp, and narrow his soul. Spiritual freedom is ever vigilant, denying malice any entrance. Having broached the theme of spiritual freedom, Washington now reveals its application to whites. We who celebrate this anniversary should not forget that the same pen that gave freedom to 4 millions of African slaves at the same time struck the shackles from the souls of 27 millions of Americans of another color. Which is to say, the end of slavery didn't just free Blacks, it freed whites too. It freed them from participation and complicity in slavery. It might just be worth saying something about this interesting locution that Washington coins for whites: Americans of another color. Perhaps today's cutting-edge critical race theorists owe a debt to Booker T. Washington for decentering whiteness. Washington suggests that all Americans are colored. Whites are simply Americans of another color. After this assertion of equal and multiracial Americanness, Washington avoids racial modifiers altogether. Nonetheless, the implication of this section is clear enough. By enslaving Blacks, whites enslaved themselves. And by continuing to discriminate against Blacks, whites prolong the self-inflicted harm to their own souls. In antebellum America, Blacks were physically enslaved, but Washington implies that it was whites who were spiritually enslaved. In other words, Washington agreed with St. Augustine, who said that it was better far to be the slave of a man than the slave of lust, especially the lust for dominion. Ever since W.E.B. Du Bois labeled Washington an accommodationist, there's prevailed an unfortunate misimpression about Washington. That label, accommodationist, and worse ones, like Uncle Tom, have obscured the fact that Washington was a statesman of considerable moral audacity. He extends sympathy to whites from a position of moral superiority over them. You can see this in the remarkable conclusion of his 1896 speech entitled Democracy and Education. There he declares that the Negro can afford to be wronged. The white man cannot afford to wrong him. Unjust laws or customs that exist in many places regarding the races injure the white man and inconvenience the Negro. No race can wrong another race simply because it has the power to do so without being permanently injured in morals. The Negro can endure the temporary inconvenience. Remember, he's talking about things like Jim Crow and lynching. The Negro can endure the temporary inconvenience. But the injury to the white man is permanent. It is for the white man to save himself from this degradation that I plead. According to Washington, by abolishing slavery, Lincoln took the first step to release both races from their respective burdens. He freed men's souls from spiritual bondage. He freed them to mutual helpfulness. Henceforth, no man of any race, either in the North or in the South, need feel constrained to fear or hate his brother. With the shackles struck off, it remains up to them to exercise their spiritual freedom. Given the events of the early 20th century, not only the outbreaks of mob violence, but the ramping up of disfranchisement, segregation, and discrimination, it's obvious enough that some of those brothers of another color persisted in their malice. Washington's analysis has made plain that they do so needlessly, which is to say, willfully. Washington is very precise in specifying what the Emancipation Proclamation achieved. It freed the physical slave and was the symbol of a more far-reaching spiritual emancipation. Lincoln proclaimed the principle that the welfare of each is the good of all. But the realization of this principle will depend on how blacks and whites behave. Do they move in the direction to which the new birth of freedom points them, toward mutual helpfulness? The scope of the speech now expands to encompass the whole world, as Washington considers the global reach of the Lincoln spirit of freedom and fair play. Lincoln himself, of course, had asserted that this transnational power belonged to the Declaration of Independence. Although Washington doesn't mention the Declaration in this speech, what he does say, namely that Lincoln reestablished the dignity of man as man, is compatible with Lincoln's view that the aim of his statesmanship was to return Americans to their ancient faith in the equality of all men. While Lincoln did not shy from the word equality, interestingly, Washington never uses it in this speech, and indeed he rarely refers to equality. I suspect that post-slavery, the term equality had become even more contentious, particularly in the mouth of a black spokesman, inasmuch as a call for equality at that point could only mean civic equality, right? Not just equality with respect to natural rights, but political and civic equality. So Lincoln's and Washington's respective strategies might be understood as an instance of rhetorical chiasmus. The white statesman appealed to natural equality in order to further the ultimate aim of physical liberty for the slaves. So Lincoln appeals to equality to further liberty, whereas the black statesman appeals to spiritual liberty in order to further the ultimate and unstated aim of civic equality. In this section, Washington adds the crucial ingredient of enlightenment to liberty. Because real freedom belongs to the soul, not the body, enlightenment is essential. The worst form of ignorance is a blinding race consciousness. Washington says, one who goes through life with his eyes closed against all that is good in another race is weakened and circumscribed. There is, I think, a tacit acknowledgement in this sentence that the Springfield riots had indeed manifested white hostility towards the best elements in the black population. Although the white rioters rampaged first in two impoverished downtown black neighborhoods, they quickly shifted to targeting well-to-do blacks who owned homes and shops. If whites were intent, Southern whites were intent on sabotaging black economic advancement, then Washington's well-developed strategy of putting economics before politics, right, or putting the class problem before the race problem, that strategy might be derailed. And indeed, the Springfield riots had the effect of galvanizing a more concerted effort to demand political rights. Later the same year, a conference, the Lincoln Conference on the Negro Question, was held that led to the founding of the NAACP. Washington was invited to attend that conference. He declined, preferring to redouble his efforts to enlighten those white delinquents, rather than turning to the politics of racial protest. In this global section of the speech, Washington presents the lesson in a generalized and thereby more oblique form. He deliberately avoids race-specific language. So, for instance, he says, "The world is fast learning that one man cannot hold another man down in the ditch without remaining down in the ditch with him." Washington couches his argument in terms of an elevated self-interest. Surely whites in the United States don't want to sentence themselves to such backwardness. Part 2 of the speech concludes with a celebration of Lincoln as a model of spiritual self-emancipation. The great emancipator was first a great self-emancipator. Washington says Lincoln was in the truest sense great because he unfettered himself. In breaking the enchainment of race hatred, he climbed up out of the valley onto the mountaintop, which enabled him to rate all men at their true worth. Thus, spiritual freedom conduces to equality in the sense that each individual is treated as an individual. It is on such a mountain, Washington says, that the American people should strive to live. Half a century later, that mountaintop imagery was brilliantly elaborated by King in the Let Freedom Ring peroration of his I Have a Dream speech. Washington emphasizes that freedom abolishes slavery, but not service. Service is an extremely important word in Washington's political thought. We've seen that part 2 of the speech presents Washington's assessment of the service that Lincoln performed in signing the Emancipation Proclamation and how that service benefited both whites and blacks, how it benefited both the nation and the world. Part 3 of the speech delineates a yet higher form of service rendered by Lincoln. It moves, we might say, from Lincoln's statesmanship to his saintliness. Or to use more Aristotelian terms, it moves from Lincoln as a good citizen to good citizen or good ruler to Lincoln as a good man. In keeping with his conviction that the personal is infinitely more important than the political, Washington in part 3 examines not Lincoln's actions as president, but his rise to the presidency. In fighting his own battle up from obscurity and squalor, he fought the battle of every other individual and race that is down, and so helped to pull up every other human who was down. In lifting oneself, one lifts others. Service to others isn't necessarily a matter of giving back or reaching out with a helping hand, as we tend to think today. Instead, individual example is itself uplifting. Lincoln's struggle, his ambition to do something and be something, speaks to each of us as individuals, no matter of what race or nation. Although Lincoln is a universal role model, Washington once again draws out specific messages for specific audiences. He begins, as he did in part 2, with his own race. The debt of gratitude toward Lincoln is paid by imitating him. According to Washington, the virtues that characterized Lincoln, or at least that subset of his virtues most relevant to blacks, are, quote, patience, long-suffering, sincerity, naturalness, dogged determination, and courage. It's the first and last of these, patience and courage, that Lincoln is said to have possessed in the highest degree. Without retracting his earlier statement that the proclamation gave freedom to 4 million of African slaves, Washington now asserts that freedom, in the broadest and highest sense, has never been a bequest. It has been a conquest. The struggle being first internal and second interpersonal does not require militancy, but instead the virtues of Lincoln, patience and courage. There are new possibilities furnished by Lincoln's proclamation, but only those individuals will succeed who meet the internal demands of freedom. Washington recaps some of what he'd said in his Sunday evening talk at Tuskegee just the month before about the value of simplicity. He also expands upon his conception of service, linking it to courage and the ability to subordinate the self to the needs of others. Fittingly, this section culminates with Washington's praise of black teachers, those brave young souls who practice courage of the Lincoln kind. It might be worth remembering that Washington, in conjunction with the Chicago philanthropist Julius Rosenwald, was responsible for the construction of 5,000 mostly one-room black schoolhouses throughout the rural South, most of them staffed by Tuskegee-trained teachers. And it was dangerous work in some cases. Whites, too, even Southern whites, can be Lincolnian. The next section praises the moral courage displayed by brave and true white men of the South. Washington speaks of those who have loyally accepted the results of the Civil War, whatever their previous stance, and who are now working to complete the emancipation that Lincoln began. He instances two former Confederate commanders, Robert E. Lee and John B. Gordon. Washington's discriminating judgment here could help us as we navigate our contemporary dilemmas over Confederate memorials. There are significant differences between the post-war behavior of Robert E. Lee and someone like Nathan Bedford Forrest, the Confederate general who went on to become the founder of the Ku Klux Klan. In part two, if you remember, Washington had appealed to white self-interest with his argument that the oppressors damaged themselves by their oppression. Now he appeals to what might be called white pride. The noblest Southern whites, he says, are magnanimous. Washington points out that Lincoln himself was a Southern man by birth. In the early 20th century, white supremacists like Thomas Dixon, author of The Klansman, were attempting to lay claim to Lincoln as one of their own. Dixon's novel, The Klansman, was the inspiration for the D.W. Griffith film, The Birth of a Nation, and that movie led to the second founding of the Ku Klux Klan. Citing Lincoln's support for black colonization, Dixon sought to make Lincoln the true prophet of white supremacy. Now, Washington is very aware of what's going on, this kind of battle over Lincoln and the legacy of Lincoln. Washington avoids making any direct reference to the Jim Crow appropriation of Lincoln. Instead, he counters with a different conception of Anglo-Saxon pride, one that does not rest on race hatred. Thus, he says Lincoln, quote, was one of those white men of whom there is a large and growing class who resented the idea that in order to assert and maintain the superiority of the Anglo-Saxon race, it was necessary that another group of humanity should be kept in ignorance. I want to suggest that this is an extraordinarily deft rhetorical maneuver. Washington does not want any element of white opinion to feel alienated from Lincoln. So if segregationists want to embrace Lincoln, so be it, since that embrace allows Washington to show that white dominance is not incompatible with treating others decently. Lincoln is presented as someone confident enough in his own strength to be just and kind. Washington throws down the gauntlet, challenging the proponents of white pride to be chivalrous and to disdain fear. In essence, he accuses the vicious breed of white supremacists of cowardice. He says, quote, it requires no courage for a strong man to kick a weak one down. Washington's like a jiu-jitsu master. He tells whites, if you really had pride, you wouldn't be without pity. Moreover, the pitiless are themselves truly pitiful. Thus I, Booker T. Washington, pity you. Recognizing that race pride is not so easily dismantled, Washington appeals to race pride of a better sort to vanquish the nastier versions of race pride and perhaps to lay the groundwork for the eventual disappearance of race pride. Washington does what he can to convince white Americans that their proper pride lies in dedication to, quote, the Lincoln spirit of freedom and fair play. The final section of Part 3 summarizes Washington's this worldly answer to the biblically inspired question with which he began: if a man die, shall he live? According to Washington, Lincoln lives today because he attained the peak of virtue, the amalgam of moral courage and patience, to which Washington now adds foresight, enabled Lincoln to suffer in silence, to be misunderstood, to be abused, to refuse to revile when reviled. Washington here accounts for Lincoln's persistence in the face of a very large measure of public incomprehension and ingratitude. Once again, there's a startling element of moral reproof in what Washington is willing to say to white Americans. Citizens are inclined to believe that the outpourings of gratitude occasioned by the centennial of Lincoln's birth honor not only Lincoln, but themselves, in a certain sense. There's an element of self-satisfaction in linking oneself and one's nation to past greatness. Washington works against this national complacency. He reminds the celebrants that they can receive credit only for hindsight and not, as with Lincoln, for foresight. Here's how Washington drops his hint that a dose of democratic contrition should figure in our remembrance of Lincoln. He knew, too, that at some time in the distant future, our nation would repent of the folly of cursing our public servants while they live and blessing them only when they die. In this connection, I cannot refrain from suggesting the question to the millions of voices raised today in his praise: why did you not say it yesterday? Yesterday, when one word of approval and gratitude would have meant so much to him in strengthening his hand and heart. Lincoln, as statesman, acted for the good of all, North and South, black and white. But he had to proceed without gratitude. One can't help but hear Washington's own lament. He, too, was a public servant who was much abused and whose aims and policies were misrepresented, often by those whom Washington called, with some derision, the intellectuals, a group of Northern black leaders that included W.E.B. Du Bois. While Washington believed that the virtues of patience and courage may be found even in ordinary men, foresight is rare, and those blessed with it need perhaps a double share of patience and courage, for they will have to press forward alone. Washington points to the role that public support could play in strengthening a democratic statesman's hand and heart. Note that he exempts the head from this, and that's a significant omission given that Washington was very well known for his definition of education as involving all three: head, hand, and heart. The statesman's head, in other words, his knowledge of right and his foresight, is an independent capacity. The attitude of the public may well affect his efficacy, restricting what his hands can achieve, but it will not alter his principles. The final paragraph of Part 3 looks ahead. Because of Lincoln's example, faith in the future is strengthened. The recollection of Lincoln sustains the faith in moral progress. Despite the backsliding that appears, Washington says, for a little season, Washington believes that righteousness will prevail, not only among us, but throughout the world. The conclusion of the speech, very last two paragraphs, Washington proposes a dramatic act in the present moment, a mutual oath-taking by whites and blacks that will bridge past and future. Declaring whites and blacks brothers all, Washington asks his audience, remember he's appearing before the Republican Club in New York City, he asks that audience, whom he calls the worthy representatives of 70 millions of white Americans, to join with black Americans, all 10 millions, and, quote, swear eternal fealty to the memory and the traditions of the sainted Lincoln. Washington's formulation of the oath indicates a key difference between blacks and whites. his invitation highlights the distance between those worthy representatives of white America, the worthy representatives being those willing to attend his speech, and the unworthy sort. Blacks are, on the whole, frankly better, for they, according to Washington, have never lifted their voices or hands except in defense of their country's honor and their country's flag. The same cannot be said of whites. Perhaps that is why Washington repeats the invitation, but with a telling modification. I repeat, this quote, I repeat, may we not join with your race? Although both versions of the oath are formulated with the deferential negative, may I not ask that you join, and may we not join? They're not precisely identical. In the first formulation, he asked worthy whites to join with all blacks. In the second formulation, the initiative shifts to blacks. After all, the condescension, if there is any among brothers, would be on the black side. They, in their loyalty, are willing to reach out to the whole white world, even though so many white Americans have so often betrayed the nation's founding principles. If kept, this oath of brotherhood, sworn upon the blood of Lincoln, could heal both the sectional and racial divides, thereby ensuring that Lincoln shall not have lived and died in vain. That is what we must here highly resolve. Washington's language here deliberately echoes the Gettysburg Address, although the idea of a sacred oath as a political instrument for securing our national freedom is more reminiscent of the Lyceum Address than the Gettysburg. Despite these resonances and parallels, Washington's address, I think is this address on Lincoln, has a different overall arc than either the Lyceum Address or the Gettysburg Address. Both of those Lincoln speeches begin with praise of the Founding Fathers, who bequeathed us a political edifice of liberty, as the Lyceum Address puts it, or brought forth a new nation conceived in liberty, as the Gettysburg Address puts it. Washington, however, did not begin either his speech or his life in that way. He takes his initial conception from slavery. I was born a slave, he says. Speech moves from the prayers of a slave to the promises of a free man. As the title of his autobiography, Up From Slavery, indicates, Washington believed that slavery served as a school of freedom, teaching those who had been through that crucible the deepest meaning of freedom. In the final paragraph, Washington offers his own pledge, and I believe he intends this personal pledge to be kept, regardless of the success or failure of the mutual black-white justice oath. This pledge, Washington's personal pledge, transcends politics. The power to manifest the highest possibilities of citizenship and humanity is a spiritual power, and as such does not depend on whites making good on their oath to justice, goodwill, and peace. In other words, even if either whites or blacks collectively fail in their respective pledges, the individual possibility of abiding with Lincoln would remain. Booker T. Washington, through times of terrible trouble in American race relations, did remain true to Lincoln, acting with malice toward none, with charity for all. I hope the time will come when he will be generally acknowledged as among the greatest of American statesmen, with much to teach us today about the path to racial concord. Thanks.
Thank you. So we have plenty of time for questions. As I said at the beginning, feel free. The room is small enough to amplify your voices from your seat. Yes?
Thank you very much for your talk. I'm Catherine Sodar from Snow College. I know you mentioned a few times the application that certain things that Washington said could have to our present-day problems. I was wondering if you could go into more detail about, in the midst of a country where groups like Antifa and the Democrat Party are working on so much racial divide and racial hatred, what we could use from Washington and Lincoln's philosophy to apply to healing racial divisions in our own day?
I knew somebody was going to ask me that. I didn't know it would come so early in the session. Yeah, I mean, it's hard to think about what it would mean to translate this into organizational terms or political terms. I mean, partly what I stressed here is that for Washington, this is a personal matter and a spiritual matter. I mean, I guess in general, I mean, when you read Booker T. Washington, you come away with considerably more doubt about the effectiveness of protest politics. But the politics of protest are now very kind of deeply ingrained in how we immediately approach anything. So I guess I think it's just important to read Washington on this, think through whether he might be right about this, and what it would then mean for people who are worried about the state of race relations. I mean, partly what needs to be done is go back to his message about education. And the earliest education. There's no reason why we can't get education right in this country. I don't know, as I warm up, maybe I'll think of more to say about this. But, or let me give you another, let me give you an example that occurred to me. Remember, there were all of these pitched battles about the Confederate flag and state flags that incorporated parts of the Confederate flag into them. And those that just turned into loggerheads against those who said, oh, this is our heritage, it's not racist, it's just our heritage, we're not parting with it. And others who said this is offensive and this has to come down, and just at loggerheads. And then there was that horrible incident in Charleston, the church shooting. And do you remember what happened in the wake of that? Those parishioners gathered and prayed for the soul of Dylan Roof. They expressed forgiveness towards Dylan Roof, this sick young man who had come amidst their Bible study and killed 9 people. And they prayed for the soul of Dylan Roof. And what happened instantly? That flag came down. It didn't come down as a result of the success of protest politics. It came down in a kind of display of this power of forgiveness. And in a way, part of what Booker T. Washington is saying is that blacks have this most powerful power, the power of forgiveness. And he also points out that the power of forgiveness in this case doesn't depend on suffering. It depends actually on rising. And he says, as blacks rise, they have the ability to redeem America. And he presents this as a kind of mission. So I mean, so that's not a concrete suggestion because you don't want tragedies to, right? But I think it gets at something that Booker T. Washington deeply understood. It shows another reason why the misrepresentation of him is so tragic. One of the things that Du Bois says about Washington, it was just all the gospel of money. Right? It was all just about material advancement. That's what Booker T. Washington was about, and concentrating so much on economic advancement. I think that really misses the real heart of Booker T. Washington. It seems to me he is the most Christian black leader we have had. I say that knowing about the Reverend Martin Luther King. King is not always, it seems to be, completely consistent in his application of his Christian insights. Booker T. Washington was consistent. I will allow no man to make me hate him.
Thank you for that answer and your talk, for the conversation that way. I'm Zach Hughes from Furman University in South Carolina. Been to that AME church.
Oh, wow. It's a famous church.
It is, yeah. It's a famous, very old church, and there's a memorial up front. And you mentioned sort of these protests around ways that we remember. Interesting, if you go to downtown Charleston there's a huge, there are large Confederate memorials in several places around that downtown. And I guess I'm thinking about collective memory and how we have these conversations, and this looking at Booker T as either being accommodating, overly moderate, someone who King, like in his letter to the Birmingham jail, might condemn. I mean, he's condemning the white moderates in that speech, but for being overly moderate, for saying wait, for not demanding and being idealistic, versus is he very deft? Is this really how we make progress? And I guess I'm just curious to hear more about, in conversations like how we remember with figures like Robert E. Lee, where we have Charlottesville riots and stuff like this, how might Booker T's example be a better way towards progress than some of the traditional ways? Or how might he be shown to be too moderate, too accommodating to white supremacist groups that sometimes win people over who, to many of us, would sound very moderate. Say things like, I'm not racist, I don't know if that question got a little all over the place.
Okay, yeah, I got two points on it.
Okay, thank you so much.
So the one about how we remember, I don't know if this is Washington's answer or just mine. We need more complexity in how we remember. Again, more education. So there are distinctions to be drawn, right? And I'm in favor of taking down some of these Confederate memorials because they were traitors. But you know, I'm a little concerned to protect the founders, and I think we can make the case for the founders. So it requires a bit more discussion and education. In Maryland, Roger B. Tawney, author of the Dred Scott decision, is a Marylander. There's a big statue. There was a big statue of him at the State House, and also a facsimile of that statue in Baltimore. They were both taken down in the dead of night 2-3 years ago. There was another suggestion out there, though, and this was a suggestion that came from the descendants, the living descendants of Dred Scott. And they wanted a statue to Dred Scott to be added to the State House lawn, keep the Tawney statue there, add the Dred Scott statue, put the two in conversation. You know, Tawney did other things. He was one of the longest-serving Chief Justices. I mean, yes, he did author the worst decision ever out of the court. But you know, maybe there's more to the man. We don't have to tear that statue down. But so yeah, I guess I'm in favor of these panels. You know, adding context, furthering the conversation. On the other question about Booker T. Washington's moderation. Or gradualism, maybe. Remember, he never relented on the ultimate goal. Right? He always said that full political and civic equality was the aim. Okay? So he was doing what was urgent and necessary in the moment in which he found himself, and that was the combination of educational advance and economic advancement. And he hoped that whites would allow that to take place if you took off the table for a time the threat of black political power. And remember, in the South, in many of these communities, blacks are the overwhelming majority. So whites did perceive this as the threat of black power. So he's willing to take that threat of black power off the table for a space of time until blacks can acquire this equipment, the equipment of liberty, and begin to erode white resistance. But he always understands the end point. The end point for him is the same as it was for Frederick Douglass or Du Bois or any of these black leaders. So let's think about what happens in this lead up to the civil rights struggle. Why did it happen when it happened? In 1865, illiteracy was universal among the black population. Few folks who could read, but basically universal. By 1900, 55% of the black population was literate. 55%. By 1940, 90% literate. Education is the path to citizenship. That's what Booker T. Washington always said. I submit it's no accident that it's that at that time, 40s, the 50s, the 60s, that you get the push for full civil rights. So Booker T., I mean, in a way, what Booker T. Washington is saying is nothing ever happens but gradually. And so that time came, and Booker T. Washington would have been in favor of pushing at that point, it seems to me. Now, then it's a question of, how do you push and how does that unfold? But it might also be noted that this happened in Tuskegee in a much, it wasn't without white resistance, but blacks being elected into local office happened in Tuskegee in a way that didn't require what was necessary in many other places. And it's because in Tuskegee, over those decades, had been built sort of black-white cooperation. And that's what Washington always claimed. It's why, at Tuskegee, it wasn't just a place of education, but also of employment. I mean, he had the idea to start the brick factory. Bricks were not available anywhere in the region, not decently made bricks. And whites started to come to Tuskegee to buy bricks. And when they got there, they started to see that black education was not a threat. And many of them went on to become supporters of black education. So by building those kinds of connections.
We'll go about here and then.
So the speech was given 110 years ago, and just a few months ago, a man walked into a Walmart in El Paso and targeted Hispanics. We have a president who's shouting build a wall and creating divisions among people as well. So do you feel that whites have any responsibility in helping in higher education to help give voice to black and brown people, to our story and to our experience living in this country in black and brown bodies?
Yes. Booker T. Washington was living in a time when those kinds of events were much more routine. So I think we would want to stress that there have been great advances. And there are times when it takes courage to speak about the advances that have been made. And this, in some ways, is one of those times, but I think it should still be done. There have been advances, you want to acknowledge that. And then you want to acknowledge the continuing problems and call those out. As to, I guess I'd like to know more what you mean by white responsibility or white behavior in response. And the reason I ask is because Booker T. Washington is very worried, Frederick Douglass was worried also, about the wrong kinds of white help. So, yes, whites need to take responsibility for their own actions, but blacks need to do the same. And Booker T. Washington, he certainly, I mean, as I explained at Tuskegee, right, he's interested in building bridges between the communities. And he certainly doesn't say no to white donors who are willing to, to assist in that way. But he also believes that this kind of self-sufficiency within the Black community is extremely important and part of dignity and self-respect. And so the wrong kind of assistance can be extraordinarily damaging. And Frederick Douglass said the same. Frederick Douglass said, I look around me, he says, there's always too much pity and compassion from whites. And he says, if you ask me, what is my response to all this? He says, so there's too much to talk about. What should be done with blacks? What should be done with us? He said, do nothing with us. You're doing with us is what's playing the havoc with us. Do nothing with us. Leave us alone. Let us go about our business. If we're headed to the ballot box, let us go. If we're headed to the schoolhouse, let us go. If we're headed to the hotel for dinner, let us go. Now, that does suggest there's a certain place for government action. Government has to guarantee that sort of access. Okay? But beyond that, not special privileges, not special assistance. So both Frederick Douglass and Booker T. Washington are emphatic that there must be one standard, one common standard of citizenship, one set of laws. That's what would be in advance. So I guess I think that we've lost a lot of this. That we need to go back to kind of the natural rights understanding and equal liberty for all.
Here, and then is there one over here? Absolutely. Here.
I'd like to ask about this seemingly paradoxical but really very profound idea that it's the oppressor who is suffering greater slavery than his victim. I I see it in Plato, it's better to suffer injustice than to do it, all the way to Gaudium et Spes, Vatican II, saying the perpetrators of crimes suffer more than their victims. I was wondering if Washington used it in his other writings, speeches, and I wonder, where did he get it from Lincoln, or did he get it from perhaps other sources in his education?
Yeah, as to where he got it, I don't know. I suspect he just got it from the Bible. But you're right. I mean, Plato says it, Augustine says it. Yeah, all the greats say it. Nobody believes that, or acts as it's really true. But Booker T. Washington did believe it was really true. And another place where he really appeals to this is a wonderful essay called "Democracy in Education." And he gives the example there of a cadet, the only black cadet at the Naval Academy, and the persecution that he suffered. And he sort of tells the story of some of what this young man underwent. Now, what would the normal reason for telling that story be? Well, to evoke sympathy for the injured and oppressed young man. And Booker T. Washington says, no, I don't tell this story for the sake of the one cadet. I tell this story for the sake of the 400 cadets, who had been educated at the common expense and grown up in these Christian families and who represented the flower of our nation and had received instruction in moral courage at the Naval Academy. He says, and yet not one of them had the moral courage to step forward and take that black boy by his hand and say, I'm your friend. So again, I mean, the notion that Booker T. Washington is an accommodationist, he just, in telling that story, that's an incredibly powerful indictment of American society. And it's at the end of it, it's at the conclusion of that speech where he says, the Negro can afford to be inconvenienced. It's for the white man, I believe. So he really was, I mean, I really do think, so much of his mission was, yes, the uplift of blacks, education, and all of the, founding the National Negro Business League and the Alabama State Teachers Conference, and all of these things that he did, right, to transform black life, especially in the South. But another side of his outreach was to white delinquents. And he really was trying to reach their souls and to redeem them. And this is where I think he is similar to King, because King, especially in his early description of what you're doing, right? Think about what King says about when you're bringing the underlying tension to the surface, right? That's what nonviolent resistance does. It flushes out this underlying tension in the community. And King says at the beginning that he is doing that for the sake of the bigots, right? To sort of, so they experience that confrontation in themselves, seeing their own behavior really for the first time, seeing the ugliness of it, and that he's doing it for them. And I do think that in the early King that's true. But King, at a certain point, I think, departs from that. And it has a lot to do with the role the media played in the struggle. And what he learned is that he could appeal to sort of the northern whites and the conscience there, and use that sort of against the southern whites. And I think that involves a certain departure from the purity of the original understanding, and that there are some real dangers connected with that.
So, we'll go here, and unfortunately this has to be the last question. We're up against mass, and Basilica does fill up, so I want to make sure that we get the question asked and answered by 4:30.
Thank you, Chair.
I think you spoke very movingly about sort of the power of black forgiveness.
Yeah.
And I was wondering if you thought there's a need for a place for white contrition.
Oh, yeah.
What that would mean, and like how that could be expressed.
Sure. Yes, there is a need for that, and how it should be expressed. I don't know how to answer that. My version of it is giving talks on Booker T. Washington. Yeah, one form of that contrition would be to just immerse yourself in this history, which is both a history of tragedy, but also of triumph. That's very inaccurate. We'll have to leave it there.
Right. So we do have 1 minute. I'd love to hear the questions. We don't have time to have them answered, but there were 2 hands up, so maybe if we can just hear the questions so we can ponder them.
Really interested, loved your talk. What are 2 books you would recommend if I wanted to learn more about that matter?
Oh, about Booker T. Washington?
Yes.
Up from Slavery, his autobiography.
Okay.
And then if you wanted a secondary source, there was a nice reconsideration of Washington by, I think the last name is Morrell, and it's called Up from History. Sort of salvaging Booker T. from what history has done to his memory. I answered that one.
Yeah. We'll have to ponder, yeah.
Oh, sorry. No, this is on the characterization of Washington that has gone down history because of Du Bois. And I basically only know it from the side of the education debate, right?
Yeah.
Basically wanted to know what Washington has to say about liberal education as
Yeah.
opposed to merely vocational training.
Yeah.
Because that is how Du Bois characterized it as
Sure.
Just really quick. It's possible. Okay, often the gap between them is exaggerated. The gap is not as great. Du Bois says the object is not to make men carpenters; it's to make carpenters men. And Booker T. Washington fully agrees with that. It's the education of the head, the hand, and the heart. Washington's understanding of education is a liberal understanding, but he does put somewhat more emphasis on what needs to be immediately done, which is, a completely uneducated population throughout the South, both whites and blacks. Public education was abysmal, not just for blacks, but for whites in the South. So, you've got to do what's immediately necessary. And so his focus is more on the masses from the bottom up.
All right, 4:31, that's good enough. Let's